The assault erupted with an intensity that shattered the battlefield. Grenades soared through the air in rapid succession, each explosion shaking the ground, filling the night with a relentless rhythm of destruction. Smoke billowed from shattered bunkers, trenches collapsed under the force of detonations, and the defenders barely had time to react before the next wave struck. The enemy had dug in deep, their stronghold built to withstand heavy fire, but nothing could prepare them for the sheer force of the American saturation attack. The ground forces advanced as the barrage continued, moving swiftly through the chaos, their rifles raised, their eyes fixed ahead. The plan was simple: overwhelm, crush, and break every last piece of resistance before the enemy could recover. The relentless rain of grenades was designed to do just that. Anything left standing was about to fall. The explosions rattled the very foundation of Flattop. Walls built to withstand bombardment cracked, metal twisted from the sheer concussive force, and the last defensive positions became fragile pockets of resistance in an unstoppable storm. The defenders scrambled, trying to return fire, but their machine guns were cut off by the suffocating smoke and debris. Some fired blindly, hoping to slow the advancing Americans, but there was no stopping what was coming. Through the dust, the first wave of soldiers closed in, pressing forward with unwavering determination. They had fought through fortified positions before, but this was different. The enemy was already breaking. The sustained grenade attack had left them disoriented, their movements frantic, their ability to fight back crippled. It was the moment the Americans had been waiting for. The final push had begun. Gunfire erupted as the troops stormed through the shattered defenses. Muzzle flashes flickered through the haze, bullets tearing into anything that moved. The enemy had no choice but to fight, but their formations were broken, their ranks scattered. The tight corridors and trenches that had once provided shelter now became death traps, each turn revealing another ambush, another wave of attacking soldiers pressing in from every direction. The scent of burning gunpowder thickened in the air, mixing with the acrid smoke rising from ammunition stores that had been set ablaze. The enemy's last lines of communication had already been severed, their ability to coordinate lost in the chaos. Officers barked out orders, trying to organize a retreat, but it was too late. There was nowhere left to run. In the trenches, soldiers clashed in close combat, bayonets flashing, knives drawn in desperate final attempts to hold ground. The Americans pressed forward with relentless speed, using their training and firepower to tear through the final defenders. Hand grenades were tossed into dugouts where holdouts remained, their explosions echoing through the confined spaces, ending resistance before it could rally. Above, the artillery fire had slowed, giving the ground forces room to finish the assault. The pounding of boots through the dust signaled the tightening grip around Flattop. There was no more open space to retreat to, only the ruins of what had once been a heavily fortified defensive line. The enemy had spent weeks reinforcing this position, believing it to be impenetrable, but now it was crumbling around them, their final stronghold dissolving in a storm of fire and steel. Desperation spread among the remaining defenders. Some tried to make a break for the far side of the battlefield, hoping to escape into the hills, but the perimeter had already been secured. Every exit had been sealed, every path blocked. There would be no retreat. The realization set in quickly. This was their last stand. The battle grew even more savage as the Americans moved into what was left of the stronghold. Grenades had done their job, but now it was time to finish the fight up close. Hallways were cleared one by one, each room searched, each last pocket of resistance wiped out with calculated precision. The few enemy soldiers still fighting did so with a reckless determination, some charging headlong into machine gun fire, others refusing to surrender even as they were cornered. Within minutes, the stronghold had been reduced to isolated pockets of resistance. Flattop was no longer a defensive position. It was a battlefield consumed by its own destruction. The last defenders held their ground in burning bunkers, cut off from reinforcements. Their radio signals met with nothing but silence. The relentless attack had done exactly what it was meant to do: break the enemy completely. As the smoke cleared, the sounds of battle began to fade. The last gunshots rang out in the distance, then silence took over. The battlefield, once filled with the defiant cries of men fighting for survival, had gone quiet. The American assault had succeeded. Flattop, once a symbol of the enemy's resilience, was now in ruins, the last defenders either dead or captured. The American forces gathered amid the destruction, their mission accomplished. The battle was over. Flattop had fallen, and with it, another obstacle had been removed from the path to final victory. The war pressed forward, but this fight had been won. The stronghold was in ruins, but the battle was not over yet. Smoke still clung to the air, thick with the stench of gunpowder and scorched earth. Fires burned in what remained of enemy bunkers, flickering against the charred remains of sandbags and shattered concrete. The final defenders, knowing their fate was sealed, refused to surrender. Some had retreated to the last few fortified positions, hoping to prolong the inevitable, while others launched desperate counterattacks, charging forward with whatever weapons they had left. The Americans pressed on, methodically clearing each sector of Flattop. Their progress was slow but relentless. Every turn of a trench could hide a last-ditch ambush. Every bunker might still hold soldiers, waiting for one final stand. The soldiers moved carefully, their rifles raised, their movements precise. They had learned from past battles. Victory was only certain when the last enemy had fallen. Gunfire erupted from a cluster of ruins ahead, bullets kicking up dust as they struck the ground. The Americans responded immediately, laying down suppressing fire before advancing in formation. The enemy's positions had been weakened, their firepower diminished, but they still fought as if the battle could be turned. Their shots were wild, unfocused, their movements frantic. The once coordinated defensive strategy had collapsed into isolated groups, fighting with nothing left to lose. A squad pushed forward, lobbing grenades into a ruined bunker before storming inside. The explosion shook the ground, and the following gunfire lasted only seconds before silence fell once more. Each position was being taken, one by one, the enemy running out of places to hide. The air was thick with dust, making it difficult to see beyond a few meters, but the sounds of battle echoed from deeper within the stronghold. The last pockets of resistance were being crushed. The trenches were filled with the remnants of battle. Rifles lay abandoned, ammunition boxes spilled open, and the bodies of those who had fought to the end were scattered across the dirt. Some defenders had chosen death over capture, their weapons still clutched in their hands. Others had been caught trying to flee, cut down before they could make it to the broken paths leading away from Flattop. The Americans moved carefully, knowing that the fight was not yet over. Somewhere in the collapsing fortress, the last defenders were still holding out. Their fate was already decided, but they refused to accept it. In one corner of the battlefield, a machine gun nest continued firing, its operators determined to hold their ground. A mortar team, hidden in the rubble, launched a final few shells before being silenced by precise return fire. The last stand of the defenders came suddenly. A group of enemy soldiers, knowing there was no escape, launched a desperate charge. Their cries cut through the smoke-filled air, their bayonets glinting in the dim light. The Americans met them with steady, controlled fire, cutting them down before they could close the distance. The attack had been doomed from the start, but they had fought with the only thing they had left, sheer determination. Inside the remains of what had once been a command post, the scene was grim. The officers had already fallen, their radios destroyed, their maps lying forgotten in the dust. The structure had been shelled heavily, its walls partially collapsed, debris covering the floor. Those who had once given the orders were now silent. Their war ended before they could even issue final commands. With each passing minute, the battlefield grew quieter. The scattered gunfire became less frequent, the explosions more distant. The defenders had been nearly wiped out, their forces reduced to a handful of stragglers hiding among the wreckage. The Americans pressed on, ensuring no threats remained. They had fought for every inch of ground, and now they were claiming the last of it. A final sweep of the stronghold revealed what was left: abandoned weapons, burned-out supply caches, and a handful of prisoners too wounded to fight. The defenders who had survived the last hours of combat sat in silence, their heads bowed, their eyes empty. The fortress that they had believed was impenetrable had been reduced to nothing more than smoking ruins. The battle had been fierce, but there was no question of its outcome. Flattop had fallen, and with it, another major obstacle had been removed. The cost had been high, the fighting brutal, but the mission had been accomplished. The American forces stood among the destruction, their victory secured. The war was not over, but this battle had come to its final end. The battlefield, once a fortified stronghold, had become a landscape of devastation. Smoke curled from the ruins, drifting through the air as the final embers of battle smoldered. The echoes of distant gunfire had faded, replaced by the crackling of small fires and the occasional metallic creak of broken structures settling under their own weight. Flattop, once considered an unbreakable defensive position, was now in American hands. But the work was not yet complete. The final sweep had begun. Soldiers moved cautiously through the wreckage, clearing out the last remnants of resistance. Some defenders had managed to survive the onslaught, their weapons empty, their uniforms stained with dust and sweat. Those who had chosen not to die in battle now faced an uncertain fate. Many had surrendered in silence, their expressions empty, knowing their efforts had been in vain. Others, wounded and unable to flee, simply lay where they had fallen, waiting for whatever was to come. The trenches that had once been packed with soldiers were now little more than hollowed-out scars in the earth. Their occupants had been wiped out, scattered, or captured. Helmets, rifles, and torn pieces of uniforms lay abandoned in the dirt, reminders of the men who had once fought there. The bunkers, built to withstand direct assaults, had become tombs for those who had refused to retreat. Some remained sealed, their last occupants having chosen to stay inside, waiting in the darkness as the battle passed them by. The Americans moved carefully, stepping over debris, weapons still raised as they searched for any remaining threats. The enemy had fought with unwavering resolve, refusing to surrender even as their defenses crumbled. There was no telling if a last ambush awaited somewhere in the wreckage. A bunker door creaked open, the metal hinges groaning from the heat of nearby flames. A group of soldiers raised their weapons, preparing for another fight, but inside they found only silence. The last men who had occupied it had already made their choice. Empty casings littered the floor, their weapons lying beside them, untouched since their final moments. The radios that had once crackled with orders were now dead, their signals lost to the destruction around them. Maps scattered across shattered tables bore markings of defensive strategies that had never come to fruition. The commanders who had once directed the battle from these rooms were gone, their forces shattered, their war over. The stronghold that had been a vital defensive position just hours earlier had become a graveyard of failed resistance. In the distance, smoke rose from what had once been an ammunition depot. The blast that had destroyed it had sent debris flying across the battlefield, leaving a crater where supplies had once been stored. The remnants of vehicles lay twisted in the dirt, their tires shredded, their frames blackened from fire. What little had been left standing had now fallen, consumed by the relentless attack. A group of American soldiers advanced cautiously toward what had been the last holdout, a partially collapsed trench where the final resistance had made it stand. The bodies of defenders were sprawled across the ground, some still gripping their weapons, others lying motionless where they had fallen. The enemy had fought until there was nothing left to fight for. The sheer ferocity of their last stand was evident in the destruction around them. Spent ammunition casings covered the ground, bayonets were broken from hand-to-hand combat, and the dirt was stained dark from the price of their defiance. As the last positions were secured, the realization settled in. The battle had reached its end. The enemy had been erased from the field, their last desperate efforts crushed beneath the weight of overwhelming firepower. The stronghold that had once seemed impenetrable had been breached, overrun, and reduced to ruin. The men who had fought through the battle stood among the destruction, their faces streaked with dust and exhaustion. Some leaned against the remains of a barricade, catching their breath, their weapons still gripped tightly in their hands. They had pushed forward through relentless fire, survived the chaos, and emerged victorious. The cost had been high, but the objective had been achieved. As the smoke began to settle, the commander surveyed what was left of Flattop. The enemy was no more. The once fearsome defensive position was a hollow shell, a testament to the sheer force that had been unleashed upon it. The battle had been brutal, the fighting relentless, but in the end, the outcome was undeniable. The Americans had taken the fortress, and with it, another obstacle in their path had been obliterated. The war would continue, but this victory was absolute. Flattop had fallen. The final defenders had been silenced, and the stronghold that had once stood against all odds was now just another conquered ruin in the march toward the war's final conclusion.